I think we'll make this as informal as we can without sacrificing any of the integrity or the robustness of the information and the seriousness of the subjects before us. We're very lucky to have the group here today to speak to us. They come from far and wide. Taily came from Brasilia, where she's a student at the University of Brasilia. She has recently visited her village in the Terena area in Mato Grosso do Sul. And she has also joined us in the group that goes to the Kayapo reserves with Laura Zanotti. So she has quite a bit of experience in many different groups. Laura Graham is a well-known anthropologist whose work I hope you've already read, and certainly will read if you haven't. Her best-known work is her book, perhaps her best-known work is her 1995 article in which she discusses the representation of indigenous peoples, including the Kayapo and the Xavante, with whom she has worked for about 30 years. I was calculating that between us we have about 100 years of life in indigenous villages and indigenous context and working on indigenous problems. Laura Zanotti is an important Kayapo expert who we are very fortunate to have among us today. She is author of the book Mapping Indigenous Lands, and she is the director of the Kayapo course, in which Phil and Emmy also participate. Taily has participated, and many others have participated, so we now have a large group of alums. And it's great to see you. I would suggest that we begin with Barbara Zimmerman, who's been working with the Kayapo since 1989. Barbara Zimmerman is the only one among us who is both remote. She'll be Skyping in from outside, and also is not an anthropologist. Barbara Zimmerman is a tropical rainforest ecologist and zoologist, and she has been working to preserve the lands of the Kayapo peoples since 1989, and the work that she's done will be one of the subjects of our inquiry today as we discuss the many ways in which indigenous peoples address the challenges before them, drawing on international instruments, drawing on their own reserves, both traditional and creative. And so let us begin. What I suggest is that we do an introductory portion for each person, beginning with Barbara Zimmerman. I'll take notes on everyone and round up the whole group at the end, and others will speak in the middle. So shall we make intercelestial contact?
Hi.
Hi.
Can you see me?
Not yet. Oh, there you are. Hi there.
I think the connection may go a little bit better if we don't video with you, but if you're okay with this being one-sided,
Okay.
or would you like to?
It's up to you. Whatever.
I was let
Whatever
everyone
you
say hi to her. Is it?
Whatever works
That
best for
before
you.
we
Yeah.
zoom
Hi, Barb.
out.
It's Laura.
Hi, Barb.
People who really want to say hi to.
I'm Laura Graham.
Hi.
Barbara. All right, I'm moving around the room.
Look, here's Phil.
There's Phil over there. There's Okay.
Okay, we're gonna turn off the
But you can leave it
video
for
now,
a
the cam.
If that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
We see you, you don't see us.
I see a fireplace, so I gather you're not in the Amazon.
No, I got back early this morning, which is why I look like hell.
Oh,
But anyway. One of the reasons, anyway.
Well, we're inviting you to tell us all of the reasons. Please, we've decided that this is going to be extremely informal, so please make yourself at home.
Okay. But, so I assume, I mean, I assume that the others in the room, you know, have a basic idea of what the CAIPO project is and what the CAIPO situation is and so on? Or should I review any of that briefly?
Well, Laura hasn't spoken yet. Actually, no one has spoken yet. You're the first. But I don't know if you want to go into it. We will be going into it in the Q&A and in Laura's presentation, so.
Why don't you give an overview of it?
That would be great.
Just
Are
give us
you
the
hearing
general.
everyone?
Okay, well-
Can you hear everyone, by the way? Laura, can you say that again?
Yeah, I think I can, yeah.
Did you hear the request that you just give a kind of general overview of the CAIPO project? Can you hear that?
Yeah, so I did, yeah. So, briefly, the summary is that I'm a biologist by training, and I worked for over 20 years with the CAIPO, helping them gain support for their efforts to protect their lands, which they fought for, and remarkably, incredibly really, were able to gain official recognition, so official, what we would call reserve status, I guess, over an area of forest, an area of traditional lands, which is the size of a small country. I like to say, it's larger, for example, than the country of South Korea. It's larger than the country of Austria. And it's terribly significant as far as conservation of Amazon rainforest goes, because it's so large. It's large enough that biologists believe that it can conserve the many thousands, several thousands of tree species, for example, that occur there, and of course many endangered and sensitive animal species. So that's where we're starting from a conservation point of view, and really it's sort of a happy marriage or an alliance between conservationists and an indigenous tribe, because the objectives are the same, which is to save this forest from being destroyed. So the CAIPO fought, and I'm sure that Laura can tell you more about this, but using their own traditional, their own culture, their own cultural values, their own organization within their culture, to successfully gain ownership of this vast area of rainforest from the Brazilian government during the 1980s and the 1990s. In around 2000, let's say 2000, that the environmental NGOs began to help them in a significant way. And what the CAIPO leaders had expressed to us was they needed help for territorial surveillance, number one, because their area is so large, and it's now fully embedded in the Amazon frontier. The frontier of agriculture now totally surrounds them. So clearing mostly for cattle pasture, some for soybean in the south. In any case, they're totally now surrounded by towns, roads, and cattle pasture. So in the context of the frontier sort of sweeping around them and threatening to sweep over them, they asked their non-CAIPO allies for help with territorial surveillance. And the other huge area where outside investment is helping the CAIPO is to develop what we call, sustainable economic alternatives in their communities. And really the issue here is that now that the CAIPO are so connected and interact so much with the frontier that they've come to depend on many manufactured items in our society, and there's a lot of internal pressure to access those items, and they need sources of income to be able to do that, sources of income that are congruent with their culture, congruent with helping them to maintain their culture, and of course the forest ecosystem on which they depend. So those are the two major areas that outside support is helping the Kayapo with, and we've seen certainly at the beginning of the 21st century that without the support, they really would by now have been completely overwhelmed by the forces, our economic, capitalist culture forces, trying to get into their lands and access their natural resources. And I would also mention the other really sort of significant factor that you have to keep in mind when thinking about this situation is this frontier zone of the Amazon, the southeastern Amazon, we can accurately say it's lawless. It's without law. There really are no laws that are really enforced in this region. So although indigenous lands in Brazil are a protected area under the law, the law is rarely enforced. So really indigenous peoples like the Kayapo own to keep out the, shall we say, the bad guys, the illegal gold miners, the illegal loggers, the ranchers who would take over their lands and so on. So I think that's a good enough brief wrap up. I don't know if Laura and Janet want to add anything to that as background.
I think that's good. Yeah, thank you.
Is that okay?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear us? Apparently not.
Yeah, you're a little bit faint, but I can hear you.
Okay. We can hear you just fine. We can hear you just fine.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so I mean, that's my summary of the situation, and we've been involved in this for a couple of North American environmental NGOs for, we started everything at the field station that the University of Maryland is involved in back in 1992. But we were really able to expand our work across Kayapo lands in 2000. So for the past decade and a half, we've been working extensively with the Kayapo to really help empower them to continue to protect their lands in the context of this lawless frontier and intense pressures by outsiders to access their land and their resources. And it's really a constant battle. It's a constant battle, certainly against the loggers and the gold miners, and to some extent ranchers, but less so. The reason it's so difficult in particular with the loggers and the gold miners is because they can, if they're persistent enough, gain access by buying off individual Kayapo leaders. If a Kayapo we know, and the Kayapo know we know, and the government knows, wherever there's some kind of illegal activity going on in Kayapo land, it's with the permission of a Kayapo. Some Kayapo is involved. Nobody gets in there without Kayapo permission. And that's why the ranchers haven't been too successful at taking anything over, because they're more of a overt threat. They're taking something of the Kayapo, which is their land, and giving them nothing for it. The loggers and the gold miners, though, can sort of play on the Kayapo innocence, really, in our culture. The fact that they really still don't understand how our culture works. They've had very recent, only really since the 1990s, exposure and interaction with money they still don't really understand money. So if a gold miner, you know, it doesn't seem like a big deal to them to let a gold miner come in exchange for cash to buy the things that is usually, it's almost always a in quotation marks, chief that does this. But they don't really understand the full consequences of doing that. And so it's been a constant battle against that kind of thing, which we help the Kayako fight back and Kayako communities by trying to help them develop these sources of income within their communities. And the best example of that, the best developed example of that is Brazil nut, for which there's strong markets for in Brazil. And because of the extensive forest clearing in the southeastern Amazon, there are large stocks of Brazil nut in Kayako land. But, you know, every once in a while there's a sort of a chink in the armor, and we had that happen last year when one of the larger communities, and sort of a strategically placed community in terms of its location in the north, near the northeastern border, it was bought off by gold miners. And it's really like watching, you know, I don't know, somebody introduce a termite colony into your house or something. And it starts out with a few, and before you know it, they're all over the place. And the Kayako leader who was instigating this loses complete control over the situation. But by then he's kind of, I guess, you know, almost addicted to the money. And it becomes a very, very difficult situation to turn around. Yet we know that if we don't turn it around quickly, and I do point out that the community itself has little understanding about not receiving any of this money, so it's not benefiting in any way, has little understanding about the consequences, including the health consequences of the gold miners using mercury to subvert the gold. But there's many other consequences. It's a path that once you go on can only lead to bad things. And so this is not something that's supported by the communities, but we do see this as really pernicious, and if we don't get a handle on it now, we don't manage to clear this area out of gold miners, you know, it really threatens the future of the echo in the northeast, where this is taking hold, and it threatens the future of our programs and so on. So, I mean, I can stop there, and if anybody has any questions or wants any more clarification or anything.
Is the community that you're talking about right on the border, on the frontier?
Yeah, I don't know if you have a map there of Kayako lands, or if anybody has one on their computer, maybe Laura or you, Janet, but it's the Rio Branco, which is forms part of the border in that northeast corner there up by Tucumã. That's where the main problem is. The Rio Branco, and to some extent the Rio Fresco, and we're not talking about Gorochiri because as you know, we haven't worked ever with Gorochiri, so we're just forgetting about them. They're a completely lost cause. However, this is a community that was a strong, supporter of the Protected Forest Association, was a strong member, and to have them get involved in this is not a good result at all.
Have you met with the chief, and what is his response?
Well, the chief is he's a strong individual, and he's a bit of a bully just, you know, personality-wise, just the way he is. And he, I guess, you know, everybody has to understand that these guys, now that that they interact, you know, all the time with Frontier Society, and, you know, day in and day out, they're hearing proposals from these types of people, gold miners, loggers, whatever, to gain access to their territory, right? I mean, it's just constant. So at some point, some gold miner convinced this chief, whose name is Nietzsche, to allow them to go in, and, you know, and so what Nietzsche has been doing has been avoiding the Protected Forest Association. He didn't come to the annual General Assembly meeting of all the chiefs of the Protected Forest Association, for example, but he's not letting anybody from the Protected Forest Association go to his community and explain to the community. So, we have at the annual General Assembly of the Protected Forest Association, so for those who don't know, that's one of the local Kayapo associations that the outside NGOs have helped the Kayapo to set up and to administer with professional educated Brazilians doing the administration that the Kayapo don't have the capacity yet to do. And these associations really act as a pole now of organization for the Kayapo and the conduits of outside support, because they can receive outside support and administer and implement the outside support. So anyway, the annual General Assembly meetings are really important every year to get the leaders together to discuss the previous year's budget, the previous year's expenses, the upcoming year's budget, and decide, you know, various other issues concerning their association. So this year was important that we, the NGO, you know, the supporters, the investors, explain to Kayapo leadership that there's no such thing as having your cake and eating it too. That any community involved in illegal activities, which in this case is gold mining, but can also be logging, would not be able to be part of the Protected Forest Association, receive any benefit of that association in terms of helping them develop these sustainable alternatives and various other initiatives that the Protected Forest Association helped the Kayapo with. So it was a matter of you have to choose, because the Protected Forest Association, your association, is receiving money to support you to protect your land. It's not, you know, the Protected Forest Association cannot be involved with communities who are allowing in destroyers of your land. So, you know, that was explained, and they were told that anybody that has any gold miners in their territory is not part of the Protected Forest Association any longer, so choose. And all of them at that meeting elected to be part of the Protected Forest Association, and if any of them had sort of following Nietzsche's lead, had allowed in a few gold miners here and there, vowed to get rid of them. Except for the one community, this large one, Kikritun, led by Nietzsche, which remained on the fence. So it's coming up now. Next week, we have a overflight to check again on the whereabouts of these gold miners, and any community with gold miners in their territory can no longer form part of their association.
So, may I?
That's what's going on now. It's a work in progress, that's for sure. We've never really faced anything quite like this in terms of the extent. it's certainly a test, and we're also working, I guess you'd say, behind the scenes to sort of, well, not sort of, but to put together what needs to be put together to get the government to do something, because the situation is really, it's near to being really out of control.
Barbara, is mining in Indigenous lands by Indigenous peoples illegal?
Could you repeat that, please?
Is mining on Indigenous lands by Indigenous peoples illegal?
Yes. It's illegal because it destroys the environment, and they're not allowed to do that.
According to Brazilian law?
Yes. It's illegal. But it's a really, it's so political. It's such a political situation. Talking with the Funai people, who, for those who don't know, are the Brazilian federal government, Indian agency people, who are the government authority, really. I think that when there's Indians involved, such as in this case, they're really, the government is, and not just the Indian agencies, but all of them, including the federal police, I think they're terrified of any kind of violence and being killed. I think really that's, and it's election year and all that. I think they're just like, they're paralyzed. But this is a really completely flagrant abuse of the law.
Barbara, last year, some people went into a village and convinced them to expel the gold miners. What was the difference then with this case?
Well, that happened, this situation was building over last year. And I think what you're referring to, Janet, is that at the end of the course last year, the first thing that we on the PIPO team did was to call these leaders. There was a couple of them, but the main one being the Kikritun leader, Nichi, together to explain to them the same information that was explained to them just a couple weeks ago in the General Assembly meeting about the mandate of the Protected Forest Association, the basis on which donations were being made to the Kaipo, and so on, and the total incompatibility of gold mining with the work of the association. So we did that, and we got what we thought was a good result. Although Nichi was not present at that meeting either, but there was somebody from Kikritun there. And we thought, they seemed to understand, and they seemed to immediately say, fine, we don't want to go that route. We want to stay part of the Protected Forest Association, and we will remove the gold mines. And apparently that happened to an extent, but we found out that it didn't happen enough, and that in fact, I guess because of the single chief, DG, he just really opened the floodgates. And so we felt we couldn't really do anything else until we had a chance at the General Assembly meeting to explain to everybody all together, even the villages that weren't involved in any of this, which we did. And now, next week, I think maybe on the 9th, there's a Funai guy, expert in this, surveillance expert, who's going to be doing the overflight and figuring out, exactly how many of these gold miners are gone, if any, and which communities are still involved.
Just one more question before we open it up. When you say we, who are you referring to exactly? When you say, we spoke to them.
Okay, I'm referring to the Protected Forest Association team. So that would be myself, the coordinator, Pingo, plus the other, the two Kaipo staff of the Protected Forest Association. So, yes, I mean the Protected Forest Association staff.
And have other members of the AFP who are not in the employ of AFP also entered into this?
Yeah, again, this was sort of established at the annual General Assembly. That was really the main issue of this year's meeting was, this is the situation, guys. Some of your relatives are letting in these gold miners. They're bad. This is why they're bad. The Protected Forest Association can't work with these people on your territory. What do you want to do? Every community has to make their choice. And all of the communities, but for Hiparidi Top'tiro, who didn't say yay or nay because their main chief wasn't even there, elected to, or what they have said is they want to stay part of the Protected Forest Association. But the Protected Forest Association, has to back up their words with action, and hence to determine exactly what the situation is. And if anybody is involved in gold mining, they will no longer be part of the Protected Forest Association, but that's their choice.
How shall we proceed with questions? We want to start with the panel? Questions for Barbara? Shall we take questions for Barbara right now?
How long is Barbara with us?
Barbara, how long are you with us?
I'm good. I'm fine. You guys can. I don't really have any time limit here.
So, do you want us to sort of present so that we see the Kaipo situation in comparison with other situations?
Can you hang in there for a half an hour while others present? Would you like to hear the presentations? We'll move the microphone from presenter to presenter. Okay.
Sure. I'm gonna just run and get a glass of water, but I'll be right back.
Okay. Do you want to go first?
Maybe switch the camera so that she can see, because she's just going to be observing.
We can do that. I'm also wondering, can you, at least for the Xavante, and it might be very interesting for the Terena too, can you pull up the ESA maps that show the territory? Because you'll see the dramatic difference between the Kaipo contiguous and our situations.
In fact, you can see on Google Earth, all you have to do is look at Brazil, and you look at you can see the outlines of the indigenous territories.
Right.
Because they're green,
Right.
and everything out of them is destroyed.
Yeah, and so that would be two good ways to see a contrast. Is one to see the sort of geopolitical map where you see what the government has allocated in terms of reserves, and then look at the Google map.
Even the Xingu Park is dramatically different from the Kaipo because it's it seems like a lot of land, but because of its shape, it's like a piece of cake left out on the kitchen counter for a week. It's all dried out. And you have these spontaneous fires in the understory. And now every third tree is burnt. And the big trees, they have fires sweep through again and again, and eventually they die too. And it's changing, the birds are not there anymore, and there's a lot of things that are happening. It's not like that in the Kaipo area.
Oh, jeez.
Go.
There we go. Is that doing it a different way?
Well, I guess I was looking, if you go on ESA and you look, at least when we go to Xavante, if you go to the Xavante,
yeah.
go to ESA, and go to their maps.
Okay, so.
Hi.
Hi.
Laura.
Hi, I'm just looking for some maps, so do you want to
Point
go
out,
to the?
can I use this one for a moment?
It's like
So
the
this is
Well, this is good for right now.
This is the Kaipo territory. You can see
The top part.
that it's the
top part.
size. Yes, and this is the Xingu National Park.
So we're looking at
So
the
all
ESA
of this
map
is
right now.
indigenous land.
And the Xingu is too small.
Oh,
That part of the bottom is too
I'm thinking
small.
something.
So you can imagine, so the
Laura.
Kayapo is unique, really, almost.
You have to check your email when you finish this. I sent you something very funny from Ken Jan.
Thank you.
Hilarious. You're gonna love it.
Great. News from the Kayapo, fun.
Hey, Janet, what are the two states that the Kayapo lands are covered?
Pará and Mato Grosso.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Look at the size of Pará.
It's big.
The size of Europe. The size of-
Janet, what are those territories, those big territories to the west?
This one is the Upper Rio Negro, right here.
And how are they doing? Those are nice big territories.
Yes, but they're not having the same kinds of threats because there isn't the kind of wealth there that you find in the lower Amazon. And also, it's much more difficult to get to. You know, but others may not realize it. Of course, the cities are in the southeast along the coast. So all of the deforestation proceeds from the southeast inward. And notice how the Kayapo reserves are now just at that frontier of deforestation. And so they really are a bulwark against deforestation, which is one reason probably why the pressure is mounting. So the Northwest Amazon, in contrast, which is the Dog's Head at the top in the northwestern portion, this has, the rainfall is highest in the west and lowest in the east. So the Amazon rainforest begins to turn into Cerrado as you go down here, and these lands are no longer forested. They're sort of scrub forest. Something that probably will come up in just a moment. The Xavante and the Terena are down here, correct?
Yeah, we'll point them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to speak? Okay, great. And I just put something in here so we could have some more visuals. My folder is a mess, please. Excuse me. So I didn't want this to be a formal talk, but I did want to show you some things as I did talk. So as Janet mentioned, I am at Purdue University. I'm an environmental anthropologist, and I just wanted to thank everybody for inviting me here today, and I'm kind of speaking alongside Barbara since she couldn't make it about the Kayapo situation. We were talking a little bit about this on our way in today, but something that is important for discussions surrounding environmental justice, I think that oftentimes we as anthropologists talk about before we begin to speak is just honoring the Native communities that used to live here where we're sitting currently, as we kind of talk about some of the same issues in terms of land rights and social justice issues that are happening presently in Brazil. So just to keep that in mind as we move forward, talking about a couple of the other situations down south. So just to give you some more context and discussion around the Kayapo situation, something that's good to think about when you think about the current issues that Barbara just talked about is two moments in time that are easy to kind of pin a mental map on to address some of the issues that are happening today. So one is the 1989 Altamira conference that is a defense against a proposed hydroelectric dam. And the second is the same Altamira in 2008 effort for resistance against a similar, almost same dam project 20 years apart. And so that, I think, will help situate some of the things that I'll say about the Amazon. So one is, Barbara was talking about the flourishing of environmental NGOs, indigenous rights efforts, demarcation of indigenous territories that started to happen in the late 1980s and 1990s in a lot of indigenous territories. And the Kayapo at that time, as she mentioned, became leaders in demarcating what is now very large indigenous land in Brazil. This happened because of several things, both the international movement in regard to both environmental and indigenous rights issues. It also happened because of the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, and there was also a flurry of activity surrounding community-based and sustainable development initiatives at this time as well, particularly centered around the Brundtland Commission report in 1987, and then in 1992, the Rio conference that, again, we see 20 years later appear. Terry Turner, who works with the Kayapo, has a great quote that I always love to say about a lot of these issues tend to go in cycles, and it's almost like Dracula rising from the dead, and you continually have to stake him in his heart. So it's graphic, but it's something that you see the same kind of actors reemerging over time in the same fights and battles being enacted, but in different political, economic, legal, and national and international contexts. So those are always shifting. So in 1989, the Kayapo successfully halted the construction of the dam project that was set to be built around their territories. And they also started this long-term partnership with environmental NGOs that eventually emerged into a consortium of Kayapo indigenous NGOs. And Barbara, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's currently 3 of them around the territory. Institute. Yeah. And so Barbara was talking about one of them today that works with a series of villages on the eastern, roughly the eastern side of the territory. Also at this time, the Kayapo began to experiment with cash income sources. So this included illegal mining and logging in the 1990s. It also included sustainable development projects with organizations like the Body Shop, and then eventually creating what was to be a very successful project with AFAP, the Forest Protection Association, and the conservation organizations as an alternative source of income. While this kind of flourishing of social and environmental justice things were happening in Brazil, at the same time, there was an aligned intensification of development and extraction. And so it really is a story of contrasts that merge together in often violent ways. So as Barbara was mentioning, this means that the deepening and accentuation of ranching, mining, timber, and now you can see kind of the development of the soy frontier is kind of enveloping indigenous lands. And so this has positioned a lot of communities with lands as some of the major conservation units in the Amazon, as well as homelands of indigenous people. And that's the space that the Kayapo find themselves in, and what's been particularly remarkable about their fight in terms of continuously creating organizations, partnerships, institutions, alliances, and their own leadership in order to rally against some of these infringements against their land. But the pressure, as Barbara mentioned, is constant, and there's always different agendas that return. So I started with 1988 and 2008. In 2008, as many of you may know, and around that time, the dam that was set to be built was put back on the table. So that's something that still the community is fighting. Construction is underway, and there's been several issues with the legal background of that, and I won't really go into that. There's also the return of gold miners in the area, which is something that kind of rose up out of some of these outcrops of gold mining that's been reemerging in the Amazon in general because of shifting gold prices. And there's also been kind of continual pressure with, again, the development of the soy frontier and things like that. So you have these major interests in terms of intense extraction and development, again, mining, agriculture, timber, that are both around and sometimes within the Kayapo lands. At the same time, you have a strong kind of indigenous movement and leadership being built with the Kayapo communities. And this has paralleled a recognition of the value of indigenous peoples, their traditions, their culture, their local knowledge, that was something, at least for a long time, was not either legally or otherwise valued in the larger community. And so that's been a benefit to the Kayapo, despite the fact that they continually face these types of challenges. And so they found to use Conklin and Graham's wonderful term that everybody tends to cite because it's so well suited, this shifting middle ground where there's always a way in which actors come together and sometimes find mutual benefit, working with each other despite disparate goals, and other times it's in conflict with each other. So in this case, it would be conservation organizations working with local communities and eventually indigenous organizations to create programs and sustainable development platforms that are in alignment, despite the fact that local ways of knowing and thinking about the environment might be different from Western conservationist values at the same time. So I just had a couple pictures, and my file here is not showing up the way I thought that it would. Let me try this one. Just to show you different aspects of the fight and ways in which the community has rallied. So I took this picture, this first one, from the AFAP website. This is from a meeting that was held last year in regard to the dam. This one on the right shows the development in the Amazon region. So all that yellow is encroaching pressure, and that probably doesn't necessarily give you the best picture of the intensity of the pressure that's you see. Let me just go forward to a couple other pictures to show you. One is these fun facts about indigenous territories in the Amazon. So it's a very unique situation in terms of 670 indigenous lands, and so it's 20% almost of the region, and 40% of protected areas in Brazil in general. And so this is why kind of conservation and indigenous homelands are converged in a lot of different spaces. I have some slides about, and I already said this, but I'm just going to show you some of these pictures. Just a reminder about sustainable development in Rio and the value of community-based capacity building and thinking about alternative economies that are opposed to these highly extractive activities. Oftentimes these are called community-based natural resource management or integrated conservation development programs. So this is the more geeky academic part of these terms. So, and for those students in here in the Indigenous and Conservation class. Biocultural diversity, so allowing for the fact that humans are not just disturbers of the landscape, but they can enhance and improve and interact with the biophysical environment in ways that are both productive and beneficial, as well as kind of the Kayapo community mantra that I've heard a lot of indigenous leaders tell me, and at least in the community that I work, is "we are strong now," is something that they often say in terms of the way in which they think about their fight and their futures. And then here's just another photo. This is the last slide I'll show you of the Kayapo area and the kind of connected Xingu Basin of protected areas, and so this is the Kayapo lands here. This is where the community was that Barbara was talking about earlier. All the red is encroaching development all around it. This is the Xingu National Park. Up here are more Kayapo lands and other indigenous lands, and there's other kind of non-indigenous protected areas in the middle here. And you can see that both towns and road-based development has kind of fishboned outward in terms of pressure in and around the territories. So those are I hope I didn't go over, I think you said 10 minutes, but we might have gone a little bit over. But that's just to help you get the kind of political and economic background, as well as some of the cultural and other movements that were happening at that time, in order to place some of these transitions and struggles into a broader context.
Taily.
Can I just mention one more thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, just in case people didn't realize this, but when we're talking about development of economic alternatives, as opposed alternatives to the illegal sector of society, alternatives to what we call predatory resource exploitation, which is what the loggers and the gold miners do. They go in, there's no types of managed environmental mitigation, there's no kind of support, community support. And the reason these activities are so bad, besides the fact that they are illegal, is because they aren't helping, empowering the Kayapo in any way. What we try to do with our work is empower the Kayapo, teach them how to make their own money, so they're not dependent on the outside. What happens in these situations with the loggers and the miners, if it continues to grow and spread and take hold, is everything that you can think of that's bad in our society is introduced into these communities. Alcohol, prostitution, we can go on and on, without any of the goods, any of what we might consider to be positive sort of capacity building, such as education and so on. So, and then communities become dependent on these sources of income, which of course run out, because we're talking about natural resources that run out. And when they do run out, the communities are left with no capacity in our world, no capacity to deal in our world, to make their own income, and to be strong. And they end up, and we've seen this happen. So this isn't theory. This has been shown to happen time and time again. They end up fighting because money is not distributed equitably from any of these illegal activities. They end up with all kinds of health problems because malaria gets introduced, sexually transmitted diseases get introduced. The mercury is a huge problem with gold mining. They end up with a perverted view or a perverted understanding of our world, because all they've been dealing with is the illegal sector. So I always think that, having my own kids, as if I took my 12-year-old and gave them to, drug dealing gang members to raise. That's what you end up with, and that is the understanding that they gain from our world if this process takes hold. So I just wanted to clarify that we're not kind of making some kind of, moral decisions here, saying, like their parents or something, and you have to do this and you can't do this. But in fact, really what our role is to explain to them the various consequences, explain to them our society, explain to them how money works, explain to them how this process works and where it ends up compared to a different scenario, a different option, a different path that they can take. That's what our role is. It isn't to tell them what to do. And so I just wanted to make that clear, because they really still have a very, very limited understanding of how our society works. And of course, our society is fairly complex, but if they don't have this influence from us, the single influence that they are exposed to from the outside is the illegal sector of society. I just wanted to explain that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the documents and kind of the legal issues that they're working with are difficult. It would challenge even an expert. So thinking about environmental impact statements and those types of technical reports, that's a fluency that often only a select number of people, for example, in the US are able to make those documents legible. And so the translation and understanding and kind of thinking through some of these major issues that they're facing in regard to both legal issues as well as technical or specialized reports is something that communities both within Brazil and around the world continue to face with this large-scale development and expert-based impact statements that are now required that often have this community consultation component that often doesn't give voice in the way that it should to local concerns.
Thank you. Thank you. These have been very important points. Who among us would like to speak next? Would you like to go, Taily?
So I'm going to try to speak in English.
Okay.
It's going to be slowly.
If you need to speak Portuguese, we'll translate.
Okay.
It's better than our Terena.
So my name is Taily. I am Brazilian and I have 20 years. I studied at the University from Brasilia and I am indigenous from the Terena people. I'm really thankful for Janet invite to talk about the indigenous reality at Brazil. And so let me see where I can start. Talking about a little bit of my people. We are at the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. It's more in the south of the country. My people is one of the largest indigenous population, yeah? And so we are really big, and luckily we don't have much problem with demarcações. Demarcation, yeah, at least at my region. So this in orange, it's my reservation, and this area we have 7 communities inside there. So beside my one, we have other 6. We are really like closer to another. And impressive, I get really impressive with the territory. Because near to my region, it's only farms. We only have farms in next to our region. So we can see another, let me just, so there, this orange is other Terena's territory. And we are one of the largest one, this and this other is the oldest land from Terenas. And actually, in the last year and a few years ago, we are trying to get back some older lands that were not in demarcation. So here we have a part on a farm, inside a farm, I think it's here, yeah. And in Buriti, this is closer to here. And this, no, it's not Buriti. Buriti. No. So here have Buriti lands. That is the latest Hetomana.
Repossessing.
Repossessing, that we are more critical because here the conflict with the farms and the police are more violent. So last year a few of indigenous died here. They were killed by the police and the farms. And so
Sorry, who did you say they were killed by?
the farms and the police, because the police was in favor of the farms, and the indigenous group that was there, they were not like trying to fight, only they were living there. So the police arrived just like shooting everybody. So
Are these cattle ranchers, Taily?
what?
Are these cattle ranchers?
Cattle rangers. God, yes.
Yeah.
And so, but basically, if I think comparing with the other people, indigenous people in this state, we are really good in the contact with non-indigenous. We have more than 19 years of contact, and as we were traditionally agriculture, we adapted really well with the presence of the farm. So now we have a really strong relationship with the Indians that work in the farms and come back to the village and keep going like this. And this is the Aquidauana and Miranda are two biggest cities that, like Terena, also go a lot. You can see a lot of indigenous living in these cities. Well, this is only the introduction. Apenas a introdução agora e depois.
Não, pode falar como quiser.
Tá bom.
Eu vou ler. Eu vou falar quando vocês parar.
Tá bom. Basically what I want to tell you guys is like when we imagine indigenous in Brazil, I think we have this fantasy that indigenous in Brazil are like naked in the middle of the forest with like the painting. And as my experience, even with my people and two other communities that I had an opportunity to visit, the Kayapó and the Camaiorá on Xingu, that Laura showed, is that we actually have a really different reality what people imagine. So I want to tell you guys that what is different, you know? And so in Brazil, we have today 225 different type of indigenous people. We call 18 years, yeah? And we have another 70 that was not contacted yet. So they live in this one is the one that lives in the middle of the forest. That doesn't have contact. So in the last research by the government, indigenous only represent 0.4% of the national population. So we are really few ones, besides of our biggest different types of indigenous. And
That's 0.04%. Very small proportion of the population.
Is it 0.04 or is it
0.4?
it's 4/10?
4/10, sorry, 4/10.
Yeah, and this size, this smallest number compared to the whole population of Brazil, we still have like different types of Indians, you know? That's why I got so impressed because we are really different for each other. Like Terena is not the same as Xavante, that is not the same of Kamayora, that is not the same of Kayapo. Each one has their own culture, their own way to live, their own way to organize your community and deal with the contact. So, thinking about the contact, we today have a really different image inside our communities. We really change our behavior dealing with the contact. So we don't walk naked anymore. We have clothes, and we have like internet in our village. So I can talk with you guys when I am in my village. We have TV. We have like food that is industrialized. Yeah. So, but what I want to say that even we have changed all these things, even we have cell phones and computer, this doesn't change who we are, you know? It doesn't change our identity. And I am a girl who was born in the city. I am indigenous who was born in the city. I only had the contact with my land when I was in my vacation time. So my father always teach me that that we can be who the white man is without letting go who we are, without leaving our roots. And in these two opportunities that I have to know the Kamayora people and the Kayapo last year, I saw how different they were from mine. Because even if even that I knew that people imagined it with the reality of indigenous, I was like dreaming to like the Kayapo, it's isolated, they don't have things, I keep imagining in my head too. And Xingu at the Kamayora people too, because they have like big houses made of straw? Yeah. Fat, big house made of fat. So I was imagining too that they were really different of mine. And when I arrived there, I noticed that they weren't that different of mine. And actually we have a lot of in common because we continue preserving our culture, even if I accept the content and deal with it, yeah. And so I noticed that we could like keep it the traditional ceremonies, the painting, the traditional painting, the stories that we like the elders used to tell, without being. No, I said it wrong. Yeah, we could keep it all this and keep it the modern life too. So, and I used to think that my people had lost the art culture. For a long time, I used to think that because since we have so many years of contact, it was like really common to see Terenas in the cities, Terenas in universities. I used to think that, oh my God, my people is lost in our traditional culture. And then, luckily, I spent my vacation this time in my village, and I could see that I was totally wrong. We are like stronger than ever, and this like really got me emotion because, sorry. Again, because since I live in the city, all that I knew is that my people was dying, you know? Sorry. Like this really make me emotional. I didn't know I got so emotional telling this. So So, thank you. Thank you. So I noticed that from the whole thing, I only had listened one side of the story. I didn't knew that I can see a lot of sides, can hear a lot of stories. And well, I was really glad because as my family thought that since I was in the city, I didn't care anymore about who I was, about my traditional. And I was really glad to talk to my grandmother. And she was like, you are really indigenous, you are really Terena. And and she spent the whole day telling me stories about our people and said to me that we are not that besides the contact. And oh my god, I'm so embarrassed that I'm crying. And so I was wrong. I was really wrong. And thank you, because this really moved me, I'm gonna skip something. And when I was writing this, I really remember two huge anthropologists. Darcy Ribeiro, I don't know if you've ever heard about it, it's really famous in Brazil, and Levi-Strauss, that during the contact that he was researching, they figured that indigenous people are not gonna exist in like a few years. They're gonna die, everything, they're gonna lose their identities. If they have like two options, if the government doesn't kill them all, they're gonna be like inside the cities and lost their cultures. And when I was writing, all that I was thinking is like, oh, I wish I could say to him that we made it, we can live in the city without losing our culture. And but even this part of maintaining our traditional and like keeping alive, I really think about the how is the situation of the indigenous with the government. And we in the 2 years ago from now, yes, we've been like suffer with repression by the government. So we are quietly being killed again by the government, and the current president, until the 4 years that she was in the government, she didn't receive the indigenous leaders. She did only receive it once, and by that reunion that she had with them, they didn't resolve anything. She didn't demark any indigenous land in these 4 years. And we have like this situation of huge hydroelectric dams. We have the gold miners. We have the deforestation. We have these big, huge farms want to get inside our lands. So I think that even that we could pass by the whole years of contact, we are in a really critical situation. So so since I was growing with my father and accompanying him in the movement, the indigenous movement, I noticed that now we need to a different type of fight. We need to change our way, change our strategies. Yes, strategies. We have to change our strategies. And once I saw a guy that I really admire, the cacique Raoni, I don't know if you guys know, the Kayapó that have the mouth, huge mouth. And once I see he talking, and he said like, in our history, our our enemy was other indigenous, other tribes. We used to fight with other tribes to keep our land. Now our enemy changed. Now we have like to get together besides our difference to fight with the white man, but I don't like the white man, the non-indigenous people. And when he said that, it's like a blink in my head, because when you go to inside our communities, you can see that your brother, but not blood brother, but the indigenous, our brother is like fighting with our brother. So, but now we make our difference gelado,
Frozen?
make our different
conflict, right?
Okay, cool. We make our difference closer, and we have to get together because like the enemy now it's bigger than us, really bigger than us, and they are more powerful if we think about the money and the arm that they have. But as I was telling again, when I was talking with my grandmother and her prima, her cousin that is one of the oldest lady in the village, they were telling me that when they were young in our village, it was really rare to see human objects, If you see a car, it was once in a year. If you see like a bottle, you never see a bottle. And the elders from her time used to think that, oh my God, we are really stupid. Like, we are really stupid. We are really stupid because imagine they built a bottle. They could build a bottle. We never imagined something like this. Ours can be so useful as this one. And they used to think like, oh my God, when my children grow up, I don't want him to be indigenous. I want to be a white man. I want him to go to the college. I want him to be able to build a bottle, And they were telling me that now they see all these years of contact, and they were saying that now we think different from our grandmothers. We think that we are smarter than them, even if we don't build a car or a bottle. We know how to deal with our forest. We know how to keep it. We know how to live with her without hurting her. So we are actually smarter than them. We don't make wars. We don't. How to say? Invejosos.
We're not envious.
We're not envious.
Avaricious. We're not envious of what other people have, right?
Yeah, we have a simple type of life, but we are more careful about others. And so she was telling me that even if I go to school, even if I go to university, if I know how to drive a car, I can't lose this. I have always to remember this. That you can, I am having the opportunity to live the both worlds, you know. So, but she said that even if I learn how to build all the stuff, I can't lose their ensinamentos.
They're teaching.
Their teaching. And so, here. I think that even it's like we have a dark way to get through if with the government and the actual demarcation situation. I think we can like have a little hope. No, I think through this we have a light in the middle, because being who we are with the teachers that we have, we can pass through this and keep alive our traditionals and our customs. That's all. Very much.
Excellent. Can I make a brief comment? The Welsha said to me, your people are like wizards. How do they make airplanes? How do they make that tape recorder you're using that preserves my voice? You're like wizards, you're not like human beings. But you're not human beings, because I've been to your cities and I've seen small children, hungry, get kicked away from tables where people are eating. You're not human beings. People treat dogs that way, not human beings. And so I think they have it right, because in the United States of America, we're the richest country in the world, 1 in 4 children goes to bed hungry every night. And that's not true in any indigenous community I've been in North America. So I agree with the modern perspective that we have a lot to be proud of.
Dr. Graham, Laura is that? Yeah, make it just a little bit smaller. Oops, that's really small. Oh, it's hard to go right. Yeah.
Can we see the relative locations of one to the other also? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, why? That's good to show the.
Notice the location of Paraguay to put things into perspective. So we've been going south. Again, here's the Kayapo area. Here's the Xingu area. Emmy just referred to the Wausha territory, and Taily Terena, they're here. And the Terena and the Xavante.
No, Terena
Terena's
is
down in Mato Grosso do Sul.
here, near to Paraguay.
Oh, yeah.
There.
The Xavante.
No, I think that's good. Yeah, that's good. I have those squares there though.
It's a village. Is it a village?
So that is indigenous.
Yeah.
No, that's what I've been
Será que usa uma terra indígena? Um paladinho adicional, que a Laura põe em cima do mar.
Oh, it totally is. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, the very first thing I want to say, in addition to like everyone thanking Janet for putting this together and bringing us together, it's wonderful to meet all of you. Some of you I knew, but not everyone. I also want to mention that on the program, Hiparidi Top'tiro is listed as being here today, and unfortunately, he was not able to be here. But he will be at the Chico Vivi conference, if some of you are going to that. He had planned to be in Brasilia with 2 days of a cushion for his flight. And the roads are bad, and the bus broke down, and he was stranded. So even with 2 days of cushion around his travel, it didn't work. So that does give you an idea of how, although there are roads into these communities, and we're talking about the pressure of the ranchers and so forth, transportation and communication can still be a real challenge. So the Xavante have a lot of similarities with both the Kayapo and the Terena situation. We might even think of them as kind of a middle in between the two situations in some ways. Is this a pointer?
Yes, okay, press the red one.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, yeah. Okay. So these are Xavante. There's that outlier up north. This is an area called Maroa Sede, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But these are Xavante areas right here. So as you see, unlike the Kayapo, they don't have a contiguous area. They're more like the Terena in that they're in dispersed areas. So geographically, they are isolated from each other, and that makes communication and political activity between members of the different locations very, very difficult to coordinate. And the reason that Xavante are on these little tiny pieces of land, I think, illustrates the politics of the nation states dealing with indigenous peoples historically. So the Xavante contact spanned about 20 years, and these people had been on the other side. This is the Araguaia River is somewhere along here, and they had lived over in this area, which is now Tocantins, through the 19th century and through the 18th century. In the early 19th century, they crossed over, so they were further east as pressure from bandeirantes, slaveholders, mining, and so on, moved west from the coast of Brazil. They eventually crossed over this river, and they intruded into lands that other indigenous peoples occupied. And so they're with the Carajás, who live on the Ilha do Bananal that's up here, and they displaced those groups. There was a lot of inter-ethnic contact between them. And so this speaks to the point that Taily made earlier, that historically, indigenous peoples have not thought of themselves as allies. They had been adversaries competing for territories with the pressure of colonization. And so then in the 1940s, the Brazilian government decided that it was going to open up this interior land west of the Araguaia to capitalist expansion, to economic expansion. And they selected the Xavante. They could have picked any number of groups, but they selected the Xavante to be like their poster child of dominating the interior and dominating the indigenous peoples that lived there. And so they mounted an expedition from the Indian Protection Service to pacify, that's what they called it at the time. Does everyone know all this? No. Okay. They called it pacification. So the idea was that the indigenous peoples were wild and savage, and they needed to be tamed like wild animals. And that then showed the dominance of the state, not only conquering these wild lands, but conquering the indigenous peoples who lived there. So it was a very symbolic campaign, and they embedded journalists, just like the United States government embeds journalists in military campaigns like in Iraq, because this has a huge political symbolic function in terms of publicity and basically managing PR in the state. that's what they did with the Xavante Contact. They embedded journalists and filmmakers into their pacification team. There had, prior to the pacification, been a number of very bloody conflicts, because as settlers move into indigenous peoples' lands, they feel threatened, and so they will attack, burn down their houses, and so on. So this is a general pattern that was really publicized with the Xavante. So these attacks, they killed one of the first pacification attempts, and some Catholic missionaries who had tried to contact the Xavante in the 1930s. So when the government went back in the late 1940s, it made a very deliberate effort to avoid violence. And so what the strategy of contact would be to find where gardens were or places where the indigenous peoples frequented. In fact, they went to the site of a place where Xavante had killed the earlier pacification team, and they left tools. They left pots and pans and knives and so on. And this was their way of showing we're friends. And so the first Xavante contact was documented by these journalists who were there. But that was just one Xavante group that was contacted right here. I think that's the area of Pimentel Barbosa. Okay, so, and that happened in 1949. The rest of the Xavante, who had then moved even farther west into the area of the Bacayí Indians. This around here is where Bororo country. Those groups were suffering extremely from settlers moving into the area. So this is another general pattern. If you're taking Janet's class, you've probably heard about that. The first push of settlement into the area will be squatters, and generally poor people. And they kind of do some of the heavy lifting of cutting down the trees, and then they plant, and then big ranches come in. And so the government put the Xavante on these different, put them in little tiny places, very disparate from each other. And in many cases, like over here, this was a Catholic mission. There's another area here that was a Catholic mission. And so Xavante, as they were being attacked by these squatters, would seek out the missions and live in the missions for succor and protection. Up here, now this is an area called Manoaisede. This was originally, the people here were originally planned to be part of the Xingu. So the original territory for the Xingu was much bigger, in fact, than it is today. And for some political reasons, the Xavante of Manoaisede were not incorporated into the Xingu. Instead, Manoaisede, Xavante lived there in the 50s and 60s, and a big ranch owned by a corporation named Agipe, which is a subsidiary of Fiat and had ties with the Vatican. So they are, by the way, the largest landholder in Latin America. So when we're talking about ranchers, Barbara has mentioned ranchers, we've all mentioned ranchers. These are not small ranchers. These are mega corporations. And the owners of Manoaisede, who then tried to employ the Xavante in the area and make them into cattle, they were doing cattle at this time, wasn't working out very well. And so they made a deal with the Brazilian Air Force and the Vatican and airlifted the people from this area down to here. So they flew them hundreds of miles to get them out of their land, and then farmed this huge area, and that was their way. Indigenous peoples were have historically been just like cattle. They can be moved around and put in different places. And when they got down to this area here in San Marcos, which was the Catholic mission, there was a measles epidemic going on there, and 2/3 of them died. This is not an isolated story. This is like a repeated pattern over and over again. And the Terena experienced that in the 1800s, 17 and 1800s. Yeah, so a much longer period of contact. So the government then they set up indigenous posts in these various different places. There was no orange boundary drawn around them. They just had indigenous posts. The idea in the 60s and 70s was that these people, like Taily said, would assimilate. They would eventually just become part of the general peon population, peasant population in the area. But in the 1970s, Xavante started to fight back, and they raided these different ranches. And again, these are huge ranches. It's not some farmer out there living with his family. The owners of these ranches tend to live in Sao Paulo or Goiânia, and they have airstrips, and they fly in and out when they need to go there. And the local people who live there, who are managing the ranch, are generally not very educated. They'll have maybe little schools. And there's a huge amount of hostility to the indigenous peoples. They think of the indigenous peoples like, subhumans. They don't think that they speak a language and so on. So Xavante were on these little posts, and they started to fight back and attacked the ranches. And in some cases, they did coordinated actions, bringing Xavante from other areas to help attack the ranches. So in the 70s, then the situation was very violent, and Xavante were attacking ranches, and so the government ceded these little pieces of land and made these indigenous territories. And all around here was cattle ranches. So these are like these little floating islands in the middle of this cattle ranching. It was cattle ranching in the 1970s. And in order to justify that, because there was a lot of pressure on Congress, this is an area where we want to have capitalist development, we want to enter the GNP. People inside of FUNAI decided that what they should do with the Xavante is implement large agribusiness corporations inside, our agribusiness operations inside of Xavante land, so they could justify granting these territories to the indigenous peoples, because they were in fact going to be productive and producing cash crops just like the area around it. So in the 1980s, the government implemented these rice projects in Xavante land, which were heavily mechanized projects. And the Xavante then were the labor. And this was something that the Indian Protection Service and FUNAI did with other indigenous people. They used the indigenous peoples as labor to produce cash crops. The difference with the Xavante was the scale. It was massive. And so they deforested large tracts that hadn't been already deforested by cattle ranchers and rice business. So that was the story in the 1980s. There was a huge amount of government resources. A huge portion of FUNAI's budget went to sustaining these rice projects in Xavante areas. Well, what was the result of that? It was devastating for Xavante. Not only did it massively change their diet, the rice, just huge plates of rice, became the subsistence crop, and people were not cultivating their traditional, or cultivating traditional foods in a very small way. And it created a huge dependency on Funai to operate this machinery. It was like going onto a Xavante reserve would be like going onto a huge agribusiness ranch somewhere else. You'd see tractors and harvesters, massive machinery. And they were using DDT and a lot of pesticides. So what happened inside of Xavante areas was a competition for Funai resources. The way that Funai was sustaining these projects would be to give a lot of money to individual communities. So the result of that was that communities fissioned. So an individual chief and his family would create a new community, and then they would be able to make demands on Funai to have an agricultural project for them. So Xavante communities in 1982, when I first went there, there were 9 Xavante villages. Now there are over 200 Xavante communities. So the result of these projects has been just one of the results has been a divide and conquer, that Xavante have become very disparate and not coordinated in their actions. So they did get these these disparate indigenous territories, but then at the end of the 1980s, these rice projects were just a huge drain on the government and not sustainable. They weren't really producing any profit. So the government, almost cold turkey, pulled out. And again, that was a devastating experience for the Xavante, who had become used to these manufactured goods, the change in their diet. They had become used to making purchases in nearby towns. And so that was another devastating experience, and that pretty much left them without any support. They had been receiving all this money from the government, and all of a sudden they had nothing. That coincides with Brazil's new constitution of 1988, when indigenous peoples could form associations and have alliances with Brazilian National Society directly, not mediated by Funai and international NGOs. And so we began to have the proliferation of Xavante associations to try to get money for community level projects. But it's, again, very different than the Kayapo situation, because Xavante are very disparate and uncoordinated. Some of the very early experiments with international NGOs were done with some Xavante communities. Inter-American Foundation and WWF had a project here in, it's up here in this area here called Pimentel Barbosa. At the end of the 80s and very early 1990s, WWF had a wildlife management project. The Inter-American Foundation had a project similar to what Barbara described among the Kayapo, which would harvest forest fruits and then sell them as cash crops to international markets. And the hookup here through some allies was mostly selling forest products in Germany. However, these projects were very short-lived. There wasn't a buy-in from the community in terms of planning the project, who would be involved in the project. The whole conceptualization of the project really came from the outside with well-intentioned allies, but not thinking about who does the work, for example, in the community. So they had this wonderful idea to plant all of these forest fruit crops there and then process them. The Inter-American Foundation spent thousands of dollars putting in refurnishing a ranch that had been abandoned as a forest fruit processing place. But when it came down to it, who harvests forest crops? Who processes forest crops? Women. Women do all this work, and women traditionally, and women are sustaining their families. So the project is conceptualized in the Inter-American Foundation project. Women are already maxed out trying to provide food and subsistence for their families. And in addition to this, they're supposed to go out trekking and harvest these crops and then process them in this facility, which is miles away from the community. It was a huge failure. So again, this is another demonstration of, I think, some of the importance of the kind of work that Barbara is doing, and why that is a model that is working better. In the Xavante, these were groups that parachuted in from the outside, didn't work with people who had knowledge of the community, and the projects were largely failures. And then they left. So these projects with indigenous communities that really work are long-term commitments. And this is something that many NGOs in the international arena don't have that kind of buy-in. So there have been a number of projects in other Xavante communities that have been funded by Rainforest Action Network, for example, a project down here in Sangradoro. But they work for a short time and then move on to something else. So this is one of the tremendous struggles that indigenous peoples face, is the lack of consistency in outside support. So I want to shift just a little bit to tell you about the project that Hiparidi has been working on. It's been in development and evolving. I've been working on this with him for about 10 years. The ideal situation would be to be able to make Xavante reserves contiguous. But given the situation where these are massive and very powerful landholders, and this area, this is the Cerrado environment, which beginning in the 1990s, Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Agency, in collaboration with multinationals like Cargill, developed a variety of soy that is resistant to the tropical forest environment. And so beginning in the mid-1990s up to the present time, this area, the Cerrado region of Brazil, has transformed from basically an area that was first cattle ranching and then producing rice to now the world's largest soy producing region, the world's largest soy producing region. And most of the soy that's going out of this area is going to China and also to Europe, where it's used for cattle feed. In the wake of mad cow, they use soy as a major component in cattle feed. So, and the players in this area are Cargill, ADM, Arthur Daniels Midland, Bunge. These are major multinational agribusiness, seed, pesticide, fertilizer corporations, and the Maji Corporation. The Maji Corporation is the world's largest soy producer, and Blairo Maji, who is the owner, the head of this corporation, was the two-time governor of the state of Mato Grosso. So you can imagine the political forces in Mato Grosso that the Xavante are confronting. The idea of making a contiguous reserve is something that is very challenging, and we can see the challenges of recuperating land in the case of Manoa Sede, where the in 1995, Xavante did get this area, and there's a whole series of processes, legal steps toward demarcating indigenous land. The final one is the demarcation, but the first is this identification. When that area was identified, the ranchers who own area and lands in this reserve, they're people like senators. They're people who are in Congress. And so when the area was identified by FUNAI, they very quickly themselves, and as well as providing incentives for squatters, landless people who live around here, paid them basically to come into the area and deforest it, to make it unusable for Xavante. And then they can also tell the government that they have made infrastructure improvements in the land and request indemnification. So there are these, recouping a piece of indigenous land is like from a corporation, is a multi-million-dollar kind of project. And this area was very nasty. The UN sent in a human rights commission to look at the area when the ranchers in the area, who are senators as well as other very wealthy people, found out that this group was coming in by road. There are roads along here, dirt roads. They burned the bridges. They didn't want the UN to see what's going on here. So the UN commission had to fly in by helicopter. Then when the area was finally demarcated, they armed the area in 1998, and the Xavante group that's from this area was living sort of in refuge down here. In 2004, they finally mustered up the courage to recoup and go back to this area, and they had a 1-year standoff with armed gunmen hired by the ranchers. And they were living in basically squatter settlements with tarps, living on government handouts, cesta básica, for a whole year. During that period, this was an armed standoff where they could not enter into their land. And Xavante men would be standing on one side of the road with their bows and arrows, and the armed gunmen on the other side with their rifles. So there was a lot of international campaign about this. Finally, in 2006, the military assisted and sent convoys up into the area and provided protection for Xavante to re-enter the territory, which had been denuded. And that very tense situation persists until today. So that is kind of the model that other Xavante communities look at and see, but there have been some victories. This area right here, this is called Wedeze. This was just annexed a year and a half ago. And there's a very lengthy process for recouping an indigenous piece of land that involves hearings and public meetings. So it's not a done deal at all. But this land was fraudulently taken from the Xavante, and they were able to at least recoup it. And they're not totally breathing easy, but a community has moved back here into this area and is now living. But it's very unlikely that they would be able to make any kind of contiguous area here. So the proposal that Hiparidi is working on now is to create corridors between these different areas along the river beds. The beauty of that project is that these lands that are owned by ranchers, they're not able to legally plant crops within a certain margin of the riverbed. So they need to leave that as undeveloped land. And what Hiparidi and his association are proposing is that the ranchers would grant concessions for them to move between the territories on these indigenous lands. This is a huge, not only a huge project to deal with in terms of negotiating with the ranchers, and we could talk more about why don't the Xavante try to recoup those lands legally, or why couldn't they buy them in a program like we see in the United States, the Trust for Public Lands kind of type project. One of the biggest obstacles is coordinating with Xavante who live in these very disparate areas. To meet with them, it involves traveling long distances, having a car, having gasoline, having an honorarium to travel, and then hold meetings with these different meetings. So the sort of the mechanics of getting all of the Xavante on board for these projects are very challenging. And you have in these areas the same kind of situation that Barbara and Laura talked about, where the government has provided incentives for Xavante to allow ranchers to soy crop inside of their reserves. And so you have the same situation where individuals and chiefs will allow soy ranching in their areas and won't go along with a project that is in the interest of a larger community. But Hiparidi is coming here to the Chico Vivi conference, and we are meeting with various NGOs and people in the State Department and so on. And he's in a process of trying to build allies, international allies. But it's an uphill battle, and there's tremendous challenges on the ground, as well as transportation and just the mechanics of getting to a place where you can begin to talk with people. So I think that's all I want to share right now, and we should move to discussion.
Thank you very much. The timing is absolutely perfect, and we're going to bring Barbara back in and open up the question and answers. We should have more questions. I'm not so sure we'll have answers, but we have a good amount of time. So please, questions. Megan, what's the, oh, yes.
How do you see the indigenous communities as a whole gaining more power within the national government? What processes would need to come into action for that to happen?
Can somebody repeat that for Barbara? And maybe Taily would be a good first person to respond.
What do we see as the available routes for indigenous peoples to negotiate with the government?
And to gain more power within the national government.
To gain more power.
How can
within
indigenous
them?
peoples gain more power? You got that? ¿Cómo os índios podem,
Se unindo conseguiriam ter mais poder.
como se podem conseguir mais poder? Ela não falou de...
No governo. Tipo, de venezuelano, né? No Congresso.
So, I think that getting the indigenous together for like unifying them, it's gonna make us strong because we are gonna fight for the same thing. I saw many times during some manifestations, some demonstrations that the indigenous movement had, that the government act like this, like there's a group of Xavantes that they don't give well with the Kayapo. So let's talk first with the Xavante. We're gonna negotiate with them, and then after we like everything okay with Xavante, now let's talk with the Kayapo. You know, like they are getting little groups, and Xavante need lights, public light in their village. so we're gonna give public light, and then we forgot about the demarcation. Yeah. And the Kayapo need, I don't know, some water. And now we're gonna give water so they will forget. No, if we get together and have the same points that we want to change, to argue with the government, we're gonna unify. They will not separate our group. We're gonna be one as one, you know.
May I interject something here? Brazil in the 1970s had a national indigenous movement that was headed by Marcos Terena, who initiated it, and that lasted less than a decade. Today, Brazil still doesn't have a national indigenous movement, and so I think that this is an appropriate time to mention that. Lori, did you want to say something in answer to this?
Well, I would just say very briefly, because I think Barbara also wants
Mario
that.
Jaruna wasn't he in?
Oh, you want, yes, Mario Jaruna was elected to National Congress, and he was an advocate not only for all Xavante rights and indigenous rights, but all of oppressed peoples. However, he didn't have the kind of preparation. You know, he was a real pioneer leader along with Marcos Terena, but he went from like 0 to 60. And he had a lot of problems. There were a lot of problems with the way the government manipulated him. And actually the story of Mario Jaruna is a very sad case. And I think actually there has been some backlash against indigenous leaders in national politics because of Mario Jaruna. I think it reinforced he didn't really even speak Portuguese very well, so reinforced erroneous ideas among the national populations that indigenous peoples are stupid, largely because of the way he was represented. And so that's one of the things that indigenous leaders now work very hard to show, that they can be educated and still be indigenous, that they can live in a Brazilian city and still be indigenous. So yeah, it's a very complicated story.
As you know, in Venezuela and in Bolivia, there are seats designated to indigenous peoples in Congress. Did you want to say something, Barb?
Well, only really quickly, my answer to what I understand the question to be is quite different, and it is solely from my experience with the Kayapo, when they are the only indigenous people with which I have any experience. But I would point out that the fact that they have this huge area of land, which I believe to be the largest area of protected, some form of protected tropical forest anywhere in the world by far, and you can trace it to the fact of their militancy, their warrior culture, the fact that they were able to organize, that they fought, violently. They took militant stances, and they really forced the government to give them that land. They took hostages and so on. And today, when I see the Kayapo get something, it's usually because they've closed the road or even taken hostage. And I've just thrown that out there, but it works.
Yeah, the Xavante have used
And
this.
in other words, I'm saying that civil disobedience, and in the case of the Kayapo and just the way they are, their sort of psyche, I guess, cultural psyche is very proactive, and they will take whatever action they think is necessary. And now I don't know how long that's going to last for, but so far it's worked well for them.
And I would add, in terms of this idea of confrontation, is I guess, more resources for travel, for communication, for unification. A lot of times communities are far away, it's hard to get to one another, and despite the fact that there's different types of ways they can communicate with each other, time and time again, I've spoken with people that I work with and saying, you know, if we could just travel to the capital, try to talk to the people that are making these decisions, or at least be part of the decision-making process, we would have a better foot in the fight. But we're limited by resources and our ability to communicate routinely. So there's been moments where that's been able to happen en masse and in force very effectively, but on kind of a day-to-day basis, in terms of access to those types of resources to do that, or infrastructure of communication, is difficult, and I think that would greatly enhance opportunities to travel and talk with those stakeholders that are necessary and or be part of the decision-making process in a meaningful way rather than a reactive way that, you know, you hear news that something's happening and you have to go redress it, versus you're part of the conversation from the beginning. And to me, that would be important, to be a key voice at the decision-making table.
Can I say one other thing? I just want to bring up the issue of communication and the fact that in the last 20 years or so, these people are beginning to use in very adept ways media technologies. Not only video cameras. Mario Jaruna was the first one to pioneer this with using the cassette tape recorder, and exposing government corruption and fraud, and marshaling publicity campaigns around that, harnessing the press. Then we see that again with the Kayapo and Kayapo uses of media. Now Indigenous groups and associations are all over the internet and Facebook. And the point is that historically people haven't known that they're there or known what the struggles and challenges are. And through using the new media technologies, they're able to get much greater exposure. So I think that is a very important resource and way that they can also gain power.
I'd like to invite Taily to say a couple of words about the use of Facebook along with Terena.
Because this recently movements of retomada,
repossessing.
the repossessing, the indigenous, and since we are like separated in different regions, the Terenas built like a page on Facebook to put news about what each village is getting through. So we now have a page that like me in my village can say like, oh my God, the farms are coming, you know, the police are coming, and we put on Facebook, and people from the other village know of the situation, can like talk to others and maybe like go there to
Give support?
Give support.
yeah, give us support. And now we have like this website that we can like share everything that Terena is passing through.
And it's called Terena Resistance, right? Jen.
I'm just interested in the play between the indigenous that have moved to cities and those that have stayed back on the land, and how much. First of all, I'd like to know maybe what percentage, and I'm sure that's different for each group, but if we know how many people have ended up leaving their homes and going into the cities, and how much do the people that are now in the cities, for example, Terenas, which are in the cities, how much are they involved in helping the people back, their tribes at home with the problems?
So I don't know a number exactly of how many people in the city, how many people in the village, but what I know is that we have a concentrated people Indigenous Terena in the city. We actually have a urban village, uma aldeia urbana.
An urban village, where is it?
Village in Campo Grande, in the capital of Mato Grosso do Sul. We have 2 urban villages.
Are they people living in the same area?
Yeah, it's like a neighborhood for Indians, you know?
Wow.
And there we have we maintain our culture there. We have this space for to have the traditional ceremonies. We have the museum of indigenous culture. We have, it's really funny actually. And back in the village, the traditional one, we see movement of people during the year. So in the end of the year, by December, January, there's we say that the village is full because everybody's going back to the village. In March, January, February, March, and April, people go to the farms to get a job. Or normally it's a temporary job, but everybody they go find a job for 3 months and then come back and stay in the village for more 3 months, and the Indians that go to the city, it's really hard to talk about if they give us support for, because it's really individual situation. So my family, I don't know, I can talk about my father. My father always keep the contact and trying to give the force for the movement. So I grew seeing my father dealing with process in the city, but when he didn't know what to do, he always coming back to talk to the elders. So, but we have cases like Indians that go and never come back.
Barbara, are you there?
Yeah.
Did you want to say something about urban Kaipo and relationship between urban and Kaipo and those that are in the community at all?
Well, what I'm observing is I think the Kaipo are in a process of trying to learn and figure out how they're going to deal with this outside society that is both attractive to them but presents a lot of danger. And I just talked about it a bit. The Terena are farther along with this process, and what I'm seeing, and I'm sure you too, Laura, are seeing, is certainly, especially the young, there's a lot of attractions in the outside society for the young. All the technology that Taily was talking about, the computers, cell phones, the Facebook, et cetera, obviously that's attractive to any human being, especially the young. There is this, maybe for the first time in Kaipo history, and this must have happened with the Terena and the group too, this really just for the first time ever, this disjunct between the older generation and the youth, because the youth are so very quickly adapting and taking on these new technologies, these new ways. They're doing things like cutting their hair, which drives the older generation crazy, which is funny for me growing up in the 70s when it was the other way, especially when men grew their hair long, our parents went crazy. With the Kaipo, it's when the men are cutting their hair that it seems to be a big, it's just an indication, right? But so things are changing quickly. But the way I see it is it's interesting because so far, the Kaipo haven't been conquered. They haven't had their land taken away from them. They haven't been trampled. They haven't been destroyed. They still have their land. They still have the option to live on their land however they want to. So it maybe is an interesting case in that sense, in that certainly in North America, our indigenous peoples were sort of pushed off a cliff. They didn't have any choice. They had their land and their means of living traditionally taken away from them, as has happened with many indigenous groups in Brazil, but not the Kayapo yet. So they are going through this interface right now that they've really never been experienced before. But I see most communities trying to come to terms with it in a positive way, and I don't see a lot of sort of social degradation or unraveling yet in the communities. As Tyler was saying, there's some essence that seems to always remain, and even those young Kayapo who are seeking the new experiences and the new technologies and the new knowledge, quite naturally they identify themselves as Kayapo and belonging to their community. So we'll have to see what happens. It's certainly interesting to see.
Thank you. I just want to insert a thought about the tools used in the pacification efforts during the 19th century and the almost unintentional power of assimilation and so-called pacification as a result of cell phones and so on. Having said that, we should continue the questioning process.
I'd like to ask Taily about when you say that you feel that when your grandmother said that you were very indigenous and were very Terena, the Welsh and some other people in the Xingu they're going to be having a meeting in May to talk about language preservation. Where do you think language preservation fits in with Indian identity? Do you have to speak an Indian language to maintain the full identity, or is it not essential? What do you think?
Yeah, this is really good. Remember, the language there in Terena is passing by a huge process that in my village only the elders talk in Terena. I unfortunately don't know how to speak fluently in my language, and I'm really upset with my father because my father knows how to talk really well, but he never teaches me. And even back in the community, the youngers don't want to learn how to speak our language because they say that these separate us, from the non-indigenous. So even if you look indigenous, when you know how to speak our language, you get some difficulties in the city, your suffer prejudice, yeah. And so, but I don't know exactly why my grandmother said that. I think just because I want to come back, because I live in the city. Even my cousins that live in the village was impressed. We all live in the city, you have everything in the city. Why you want to come back? And my grandmother, I think she recognized this, that I want to know about my history. Even if my father didn't teach me the language, I am looking forward. I guess it's because of this.
Are there any efforts underway to strengthen the language? And you've heard Terena spoken your whole life, right?
Not so much, only family things that I was not supposed to know. My grandmother talked to me in Portuguese, but when someone arrived and she wanted to tell a gossip, and she started talking Terena.
Can you understand?
Yeah, it's like a secret language. You can't know what I'm talking about.
Can you understand it now?
I'm learning a few words, but it's really difficult to remember, I know a few words, and then you are talking in the middle of the conversation and I know this word but I don't remember what it means, something like this. But I'm learning.
But it's always like that when you learn a language, and you could really be a leader for your community. You, as someone who has so much prestige and knowledge of the outside world, thinks it's important to learn Terena. would really be inspiration. And, you know, if outsiders can go in and learn an indigenous language, certainly you can for your whole life.
Yeah, but the problem is because I was really messed. Because it's difficult when you get old to learn another language. So I was trying to learn Kayapo. I was trying to learn Kamaribara and Terena at the same time.
Oh, boy.
So
That's a little ambitious. Yeah.
it was difficult.
Pick one.
Yeah.
Jackie.
I had a question, I guess, for both Taily and Laura Graham in terms of what you think about how anthropologists and other researchers might best do collaborative work with indigenous communities. I work in a different context. I work in Mexico on language and educational issues. So this has been really interesting and informative. And Laura, you, I think, gave such a nice synopsis of some of the goals of environmental anthropology along with the pitfalls. And so I just wanted to ask just a larger question of what are some of the good ways that you've seen researchers come in and work with indigenous communities in collaborative ways, whether it's for environmental purposes or other ones.
I think that's germane to everyone, really.
Including Barbara.
Yeah.
Só para deixar claro, ela perguntou qual seria, tipo, como o antropólogo poderia ajudar-nos.
Exatamente, ou colaborar.
In the good ways that you've observed, instead of some of the bad examples that we all know about.
I think I'll reference Janet in my response. I think that both Barbara and Janet, in building this course through the University of Maryland and through initially Conservation International, but now the Associated Southwest of Cochachita, have collaborated with one Kayapo community for several years now on bringing university students to the community, respecting local leaders and others in the village as knowledge experts and knowledge holders, and so they serve as our guides and instructors, and always responding to local needs in terms of ways in which they like to see the course develop and evolve. So every year there's discussions about how we can improve it. Next year, what are the things that we can do differently? What are the ways it's working? What needs improvement? And so this aspect of bringing students both from Brazil and from the US in a collaborative environment alongside the Kayapo, despite large language barriers, I think is one good example of the way that you can have a continuous presence, raise consciousness about these issues to both Brazilian students and US and other. It had an international presence too, so students that come from China and all over. And so that's one of the ways I think is a good example of kind of collaborative work. And we're looking to new and innovative ways of working with the community on different film projects and multimedia projects and things like that. But I'll just stop there because I think that others at the table can talk about things like collaborative filmmaking and those examples as well.
I think collaboration begins with good listening. You're in a very important position if you can go between the community and the centers of power. You can, as Laura Graham has done, both articulate the difficulties, challenges, and so on of the Xavante, but also bring up to the centers of power a Xavante spokesperson who is extremely articulate on the matter and who has a great deal to say. So I think acting as a catalyst in providing the means for
Indigenous peoples to get to the centers of power is very, very, very important. So too is carrying information back to the community, because many communities have been in the past remote. It's exciting to see the good side of the changes in technology insofar as they disseminate information in the most democratic of manners. And so through a combination of radio and internet, Indigenous peoples have access to information that before they never had access to. Barbara, did you want to say something about collaborating?
No, I think you put it really well. It really is when we started, or I guess when I started working with the Kayako, I can tell you I didn't have the slightest clue what I was doing. I was a biologist, and all I knew is that Kayako were awesome, and they were protecting this huge area of land, and that was really a matter of figuring out this dialogue that you talked about, Janet, and listening to them and how they felt they needed to be helped. And then I think this has also been mentioned in the last while, is there are projects and there are projects. You've got to do the ones that work, and you've got to be there as an NGO or as an outsider trying to help Indigenous people keep their land and their rights. You've got to be in there long term. It's not a short term thing. We view this as an alliance. Okay, it's an alliance to really ultimately, the way I see it, and other people see it differently, but it's an alliance to protect this land. And if the Kayako have their land, they have the options for their future. They're not going to be pushed off the cliff that are referred to. So it's an alliance and figuring out what works for, not what works in your Western mind, but what works for their communities in the context of their culture. So it's really all I think I could say.
Thank you. That was very well put.
I'll just say, because I think most of the really good essential points have been made. I often think of myself as a facilitator, which is really another way of saying some of what other people have said, but listening, and I think we tend to underestimate that we have skills, but we do have skills. Just the knowledge that we have of our own society, that we can then explain to them. The knowledge that we know of what's happened with other groups in the same situation. Not that you're prescribing this is what you need to do, but this is what happens in the United States where Indigenous peoples have not had their land or they drink alcohol. Being a conduit for information and someone who can provide access to others, like Barbara said, she didn't know what she was doing when she began. In many cases, Xavante will ask me things I don't know about, but I have the skills to be able to find them, or the means to find information, the means to find contacts, and help set up meetings. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that's a really important thing. And Indigenous peoples, there is a lot of tension on this issue of, anthropology as a colonial extractive enterprise, which in many ways, that is our history. And there can be resistance sometimes, but the long-term commitment that we keep hearing, it's not like I'm sure in any of our experiences working with these communities, there hasn't been a lot of pain or there hasn't been challenges. But I think one of the biggest things is the long-term commitment. So I just want to underscore that.
Barbara, do you have grandchildren among the Kayako?
Yeah. Yeah,
Lori,
for sure. I probably have great grandchildren now. I kind of lose count.
I think that's a good note to stop on. Thank you all very much.